The dust of the Chihuahuan high desert settled like a shroud over Elias Thorne's vast, empty ranch, each particle a grain of solitude in the hourglass of his life. Years had passed since Martha's laughter had echoed off the adobe walls of the main house. Years since the scent of her rosewater and baking bread had perfumed the air. Now the silence was a living thing, vast and oppressive, broken only by the mournful lowing of his cattle or the sigh of the wind through the sparse, resilient grama grass. He was a cattle baron, they called him, a man whose herd stretched as far as the eye could see, whose land drank the horizon. Yet, within the fortress of his prosperity, Elias was a prisoner of memory, a widower whose heart had calcified around a core of grief. The advertisement he'd finally, reluctantly, instructed his foreman to post in the distant, dusty town of Redemption was a practical matter. Cook wanted, sober, reliable, apply Thorne Ranch. It was a concession to the gnawing emptiness of his belly, not his soul, or so he told himself. He'd expected a grizzled chuckwagon veteran, perhaps, or a stern, capable woman of indeterminate age whose disapproval would be as sharp as her biscuits. He had not expected the apparition that materialized at his doorstep one searing afternoon, when the sun beat down with the fury of a blacksmith's forge. She stood framed in the harsh light, a woman so slight a strong gust might carry her away, her dress the color of dust and despair, patched and repatched until its original pattern was a distant memory. Beside her, clutching her skirt with a small dirty hand, stood a boy, no more than 5 or 6 winters, his eyes wide and dark in a face too thin, too solemn for his age. The woman's gaze, when it met Elias's, was a mixture of raw fear and a desperate, hunted hope that tugged at something deep within him, something he thought long dead. I saw your notice, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice raspy, as if dredged from a dry well. It was soft, yet it carried the tremor of someone who had run a long, hard race and was not yet sure if she had reached safety or another starting line. For the cook, Elias's weathered face, usually a mask of stoic composure, registered a flicker of surprise. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of hard work, his hands calloused and capable, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky, accustomed to scanning distant horizons for trouble or stray cattle. He looked from the woman's exhausted face to the boy's equally weary one, then back to her. She didn't look like any cook he'd ever encountered. She looked like she needed a square meal and a month of sleep more than she needed employment. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a ghost of the protectiveness he'd once felt for Martha, mingled with a stark, pragmatic assessment of the situation. This was not what he'd advertised for. This was complicated. "You're applying for the cook's position?" he asked, his voice gruffer than he intended, the words emerging as if unused to the open air. He saw her flinch, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but he caught it. Her chin, however, lifted a fraction. "Yes, sir. I can cook. Plain fare, mostly, but I'm a hard worker. And my son, Tom, he's no trouble. He minds well." Her hand tightened on the boy's shoulder, a small, fierce gesture of maternal defense. Elias's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at the boy, who stared back with an unnerving adult stillness. He remembered another small hand, Martha's, growing frail in his. A wave of an old, familiar ache washed over him. He had sought a cook, a simple, uncomplicated transaction to fill a practical need. What stood before him was a plea, unspoken but potent, wrapped in the guise of an application. His mind, accustomed to assessing risk and reward in cattle and land, wrestled with a different kind of equation. Turning them away felt like a cruelty he wasn't sure he possessed, despite the hardness the years had tried to instill in him. The prairie was unforgiving, and a woman and child alone. He thought of Martha's gentle heart, how she would have reacted. "The work is hard," he stated, more to test her resolve than to dissuade her. "Long hours. This ranch, it's isolated." "We're not afraid of hard work, Mr. Thorne," she replied, a faint spark igniting in her tired eyes. "Or isolation," The last word was spoken with a strange emphasis, as if isolation might be a sanctuary rather than a hardship. He looked out over his land, the endless expanse of it, the way the mountains bruised the sky in the distance. It was a kingdom of solitude. Perhaps, he thought, it had room for 2 more lost souls. He made a decision then, one that went against every instinct for self-preservation he'd cultivated since Martha's passing. "The last cook left without notice," he said, his tone neutral. "Kitchen's through there. There's food in the pantry. You and the boy look like you could use a meal and a night's rest before we discuss wages or duties." He gestured with his chin towards the sprawling main house. "There are empty rooms upstairs. Or the old foreman's cabin is clean enough if you'd prefer some distance." He didn't want to pry, not yet, but her weariness was a palpable thing, a heavy cloak she wore. Relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees, washed over Lila. She had walked for days, it felt like, the advertisement a tiny, flickering candle of hope in a vast darkness. Jedediah's face, contorted in rage, had haunted her steps, his threats echoing in the lonely howl of the coyotes. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. The cabin would be fine. Distance felt safer, a buffer against the unknown, even from the stern, quiet man whose unexpected kindness was a fragile lifeline. Elias merely grunted, a sound that could mean anything, and led the way not to the main house, but to a small, weathered cabin set a respectful distance away, nestled under the solitary cottonwood that marked a long dry spring. It was Spartan, 2 small rooms and a lean-to kitchen, but to Lila it looked like a fortress. He showed her the basics, the pump outside, the woodpile, the simple stove. He left a sack of flour, some dried beans, coffee, and a slab of bacon on the rough-hewn table. "There's a stew simmering on the stove in the main house if you're too tired to cook tonight," he said, his gaze lingering on Tom for a moment before he turned to leave. "Lock the door." The last was an instruction, but it carried an undertone of concern that did not escape Lila. Once he was gone, Lila sank onto the edge of the narrow cot, Tom pressing close against her side. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks eased its suffocating grip, just a little. She felt the boy's small body trembling. "We're safe for now, Tomcat," she whispered, stroking his hair. "We're safe," but the words tasted like ash in her mouth, for she knew Jedediah's shadow was long, and his malice boundless. She had seen the way Mr. Thorne looked at them, a mixture of pity and suspicion. She would have to prove her worth, prove she was more than just a burden. Over the next few days, Elias observed her. He was a man of few words, his interactions with her brief and functional. He'd asked her to prepare a simple breakfast and supper for him, his expectations seemingly low. Lila, despite her exhaustion, threw herself into the work. The small cabin, under her touch, began to shed its air of neglect. She scrubbed, mended, and cooked with a quiet desperation. The food she prepared was simple, as she'd promised, but it was wholesome, seasoned with a care that spoke of a desire to please, to earn her keep. He noticed the way she moved, with a weariness that went bone deep, yet with an underlying resilience that reminded him of the prairie wildflowers that pushed through sun-baked earth after a rare rain. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she would sometimes pause, her gaze distant and haunted, before visibly shaking herself back to the present. Tom was a silent shadow of his mother, his small face serious as he explored the immediate vicinity of the cabin, never straying far. Elias, on his rides around the ranch, would sometimes see the boy watching him from a distance, his dark eyes following every move. Once, Elias had found a small, crudely carved wooden horse left near the well, clearly the boy's handiwork. He'd picked it up, the rough wood surprisingly comforting in his large hand, and left it on the porch of their cabin without a word. The next day it was gone, and he thought he saw a flicker of something. Surprise? Gratitude? In the boy's eyes when their paths crossed. Lila remained wary, flinching if he moved too suddenly or spoke too sharply. She answered his questions about her cooking or the supplies she needed with a quiet deference, but volunteered nothing about her past. Elias, in turn, respected her silence, though curiosity, an emotion he rarely indulged, pricked at him. He saw the faint, discolored bruise that peeked from beneath her collar one morning, a sickening yellow-purple against her pale skin, and a cold anger settled in his gut. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough of the world's cruelty. He began to leave extra provisions, a piece of dried fruit for the boy, a newer, warmer blanket on their porch as the nights grew colder. Small gestures unacknowledged, but he hoped understood. He found himself thinking of Martha, of her belief in the inherent goodness of people, a belief he had long since discarded. Yet, watching Lila's quiet struggle, a sliver of that belief began to reassert itself. The first hint of the storm she was fleeing came not in words, but in a nightmare. Elias had been checking the corral late one night, the moon a sliver in the inky sky, when he heard a muffled scream from the direction of the cabin. It was followed by a choked sob, then Lila's voice, tight with terror, trying to soothe a crying Tom. Elias hesitated, his instinct to intervene warring with his desire not to intrude. He stood there for a long moment, the cool night air raising gooseflesh on his arms, a grim understanding dawning. She wasn't just a woman down on her luck. She was running from something or someone. The bruise he'd seen took on a more sinister meaning. The next morning, Lila's eyes were shadowed, her face pale. She avoided his gaze, her movements jerky and uncertain. Elias knew he had to address it, but gently. He found her by the woodpile, her small frame struggling with an axe that was too large for her. He took it from her hand, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. She pulled back as if burned. "Let me," he said, his voice softer than usual. He split a few logs with practiced ease, then leaned the axe against the pile. "Lila," he began, using her first name for perhaps only the second or third time. She looked up, her eyes wide with apprehension. "You and the boy, you're safe here. On my land." Her composure, so carefully maintained, began to crumble. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "He'll find us," she whispered, the words ragged. "Jedediah, my husband. He said he'd always find me. He said I belonged to him, like property." Her voice broke. "He wants Tom, not out of love, but to control me, to hurt me." The story tumbled out then, a torrent of fear and pain held back for too long. She spoke of Jedediah's rages, his possessiveness, the casual cruelty that had escalated over the years until she feared for her life, and worse, for Tom's spirit. She'd slipped away one night with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few hoarded coins, walking towards a vague notion of the West, of anonymity, until she saw his advertisement. "I know I'm not what you wanted for a cook, Mr. Thorne," she finished, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But I had to try. For Tom." Elias listened, his face impassive, but inside, a slow burn of anger grew. He thought of Martha, lost to illness, a cruel fate he could not fight. But this was a man-made evil, a deliberate infliction of suffering. He looked at Lila, at the raw vulnerability in her eyes, and the last of his carefully constructed emotional walls began to crack. He understood the desperate need to protect what was precious. He'd failed Martha, in his own mind, unable to shield her from death. He wouldn't fail this woman and child. "Your husband," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "If he comes here, he'll be dealing with me." It was not a boast, but a statement of fact, cold and hard as the iron in his will. He saw a flicker of hope, fragile but real, ignite in her eyes. "You and Tom will stay. You'll cook, yes, but you're not just my cook, Lila. You're under my protection." He hesitated, then added gruffly, "Martha, my wife," she had a saying. "A shared burden is a lighter load, perhaps. Perhaps we can lighten each other's." It was the most he'd spoken of Martha to anyone in years. A crack in his own armor offered as a shield to hers. Lila stared at him, tears streaming freely now, but they were no longer solely tears of fear. There was gratitude, disbelief, and a nascent sense of security she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," she breathed, the words heartfelt. Thank you, Elias. His use of Martha's name, the sharing of that intimate piece of his past, was a profound gesture, an offering of trust she instinctively recognized and cherished. In the weeks that followed, a subtle shift occurred on the Thorn Ranch. The oppressive silence that had long reigned in the main house began to recede, replaced by the clatter of pots and pans, the scent of baking bread, and sometimes, the hesitant sound of Tom's laughter as he played near the kitchen door. Lila, buoyed by Elias's quiet assurance of protection, began to shed her hunted look. Color returned to her cheeks, and a tentative light to her eyes. She moved with more confidence, her cooking becoming more adventurous, her simple meals imbued with a warmth that nourished more than just the body. Elias found himself looking forward to mealtimes, not just for the food, but for the quiet companionship. He'd sit at the long, empty table in the dining room, and Lila would serve him, her movements efficient, her presence a gentle counterpoint to the harshness of his days. Sometimes, Tom would sit on a small stool by the hearth, drawing on a piece of slate Elias had given him, his earlier silence giving way to occasional, shy questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about the distant, purple mountains. Elias, in turn, found himself speaking more, sharing small details about the ranch operations, pointing out a hawk circling overhead, or explaining the different calls of the coyotes at night. He taught Tom how to whittle, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he guided the boy's smaller ones. He saw the way Lila's gaze would soften as she watched them, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. He began to notice things about her he hadn't before, the way a stray curl escaped her severe bun to soften the line of her jaw, the quiet intelligence in her eyes when she listened, the inherent grace in her movements despite the weariness that still clung to her. He found himself comparing her resilience to the tough, beautiful desert blooms that defied the arid landscape. One evening, a dust storm blew in, fierce and sudden, rattling the windows and obscuring the world in a brown haze. Elias, Lila, and Tom were in the main house kitchen, the warmth of the stove a welcome comfort against the howling wind. Lila had made a stew, rich and savory, and for the first time, Elias insisted she and Tom eat with him at the big table. Hesitantly, she agreed. The shared meal, with the storm raging outside, felt intimate, a small circle of light and warmth against the vast, wild darkness. Elias found himself talking about his early days on the ranch, the struggles, the dreams he'd had. Lila listened, her chin resting on her hand, her eyes thoughtful. She, in turn, spoke of her childhood on a small farm far to the east, of her love for growing things, a love that had been stifled by Jedediah's harshness. As the storm abated, leaving the air washed clean and the stars blazing with an unnatural brilliance, a comfortable silence settled between them. Tom had fallen asleep, his head pillowed on Lila's lap. Elias looked at them, mother and child, bathed in the soft lamplight, and a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a potent mix of tenderness and longing, stirred within him. It was more than just protectiveness now. It was a deeper, more personal connection. He saw not just a woman in need, but Lila, a woman of quiet strength and gentle spirit, a woman whose presence was slowly, surely, breathing life back into his dormant heart. He remembered one afternoon. He'd come in from a long ride, parched and weary. Lila had a pitcher of lemonade waiting, tart and sweet, the ice clinking like tiny bells. It was something Martha used to make. He'd paused, the glass halfway to his lips, a wave of memory so intense it almost buckled him. Lila had seen the look on his face, her own expression clouding with concern. "Is something wrong, Elias?" she'd asked softly. He'd shaken his head, managed a gruff, "No, it's good, real good," but the shared moment, the unspoken understanding that passed between them, had been a turning point. He realized he wasn't just offering her shelter. She was offering him something too, a chance to feel again, to live again. Their fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. Elias had known, with a grim certainty, that Jedediah was a threat that could not be wished away. He'd made discreet inquiries in redemption, learning that a man fitting Jedediah's description, large, loud, with a cruel streak and a possessive air, had been asking questions about a woman and a boy. The news settled like a stone in Elias's gut. He increased his vigilance, his old Colt 45 now a constant companion, his eyes scanning the horizon not just for stray cattle, but for a different kind of predator. The confrontation, when it came, was as ugly and inevitable as a summer thunderstorm. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red. Elias was mending a fence line not far from the main house when he saw 3 riders approaching, moving too fast, too purposefully. His heart sank. He recognized the swagger of the lead rider even from a distance. Jedediah. Lila, who had been hanging out laundry near her cabin, saw them too. Her face went white as bleached bone. She snatched Tom, who had been playing nearby, and practically flew towards the main house, her voice a choked cry, "Elias!" Elias was already moving, his long strides eating up the ground. He met her on the porch, pushing her and Tom behind him. "Get inside. Lock the door. Stay away from the windows," he ordered, his voice calm but steely. Jedediah and his 2 cronies, rough-looking men with mean eyes, reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, their mounts kicking up dust that swirled around them like an evil omen. Jedediah was a big man, florid-faced and bloated, a sneer twisting his lips. His eyes, small and pig-like, fixed on Lila cowering behind Elias. "Well, well, well," Jedediah drawled, his voice oily and menacing. "Look what we have here, my dear Lila. And my boy Tom. Been wondering where you'd run off to, darlin'." He ignored Elias completely, his gaze possessive and cruel as it lingered on Lila. Elias stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between Jedediah and the door. "This is private property," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "State your business and be gone." Jedediah finally turned his attention to Elias, his eyes narrowing. "My business is with my wife and my son. That woman there, she's mine. And the boy, he's mine too. I've come to take them home." He spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt. "She's not going anywhere with you," Elias stated, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. "Neither is the boy. They're under my protection." Jedediah's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Your protection? You old fool. She's my wife. The law says she belongs to me. Now, step aside before you get hurt." One of his cronies shifted in his saddle, his hand moving towards his own gun. "The only law that matters here is the one that says a man protects those in his care," Elias countered, his gaze unwavering. "And you, sir, are no husband. You're a bully and a coward." Lila, who had been trembling behind Elias, felt a surge of courage, fueled by Elias's steadfastness and her own fierce love for her son. She stepped out from behind him, her small frame surprisingly resolute. "I'm not your wife anymore, Jedediah," she said, her voice clear and strong, surprising even herself. "And I'll die before I let you take Tom or lay another hand on me." Jedediah's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful bitch," he snarled, raising his hand as if to strike her, even from that distance. "You'll do as you're told." He spurred his horse forward a step. "That's far enough," Elias warned, his voice like the crack of a whip. His hand was on his gun now, his stance solid, unmovable. For a long moment, tension hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke on. The wind whispered through the eaves of the house, a mournful sound. Tom, hidden behind Lila's skirts, let out a small, terrified whimper. Jedediah's eyes darted from Elias's cold, determined face to Lila's unexpected defiance, then to his 2 companions, who looked suddenly less confident. He was a bully used to cowing those weaker than himself. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance, this quiet, unyielding strength from an old rancher and a woman he considered his property. "This ain't over, Thorn," Jedediah growled, his bravado faltering. "She's mine. The law's on my side." The law has a long reach, Elias replied evenly. But it doesn't reach here today. Today you're dealing with me, and I'm telling you to ride out and never come back. If I see your face on my land again, I won't be so patient. There was a finality in his tone, a promise of violence held barely in check, that even Jedediah's thick skull could comprehend. Jedediah hesitated, his face a mask of fury and frustration. He looked at Lila one last time, his eyes filled with venom. "You'll regret this, Lila," he spat. Then, with a curse, he wrenched his horse's head around and galloped away, his two cronies scrambling to follow, their retreat ignominious and swift. They watched until the riders were dust on the horizon. Only then did Elias allow himself to relax, his shoulders slumping slightly. He turned to Lila. She was pale but standing tall, Tom clinging to her legs. Her eyes, when they met his, were filled with a profound gratitude and something else, something deeper, that made his old heart ache with a new, unfamiliar warmth. "It's over," he said, his voice still rough. He won't be back, he hoped it was true. Lila reached out, her hand trembling, and laid it on his arm. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." Her touch was light, yet it sent a jolt through him, a current of connection that was both startling and intensely welcome. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, the ranch seemed to breathe again. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the air cooled, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Inside the kitchen, the lamplight created a haven of warmth. Lila busied herself making coffee, her movements still a little shaky, while Elias checked the locks on the doors and windows, his earlier calm replaced by a simmering anger at Jedediah's audacity and cruelty. Tom, recovering from his fear, sat at the table, meticulously drawing a picture of a large, imposing man standing protectively in front of a smaller woman and a child. When Lila brought Elias his coffee, their hands brushed again. This time, neither pulled away. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, a universe of unspoken emotions swirled: relief, gratitude, and a dawning awareness of a bond forged in shared adversity. He saw the strength in her, the fierce maternal love that had given her the courage to flee, to fight. She saw in him not just a rescuer, but a man of deep integrity and unexpected tenderness, a man who had offered her sanctuary when the world had offered only cruelty. "He called you old?" Lila said softly, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips, an attempt to lighten the lingering tension. Elias snorted, a rare flash of dry humor in his eyes. "Takes more than a loudmouth like him to make me feel old." He paused, then looked at her, his expression serious. "Lila, what I said about you and Tom staying, I meant it. This is your home now, if you want it." Tears welled in Lila's eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief, of a profound, bone-deep gratitude. We have nowhere else to go, Elias, and nowhere else we'd rather be." She hesitated, then voiced the question that had been hovering in her heart. "But what about you? We're a burden. A woman and a child." Elias reached across the table and, for the first time, took her hand. His calloused fingers enveloped hers, surprisingly gentle. "Lila," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "This ranch, this house, it's been empty for too long. Since Martha?" He paused, the old grief a shadow in his eyes, but no longer all-consuming. "You and Tom, you're not a burden. You're bringing life back to this place. To me." The confession hung in the air, simple, honest, and deeply moving. Lila's fingers tightened around his. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, the years of quiet sorrow, and her heart ached for him, even as it swelled with a new, burgeoning affection. She had come seeking a refuge, a job, and had found something far more precious. A protector, a companion, a man whose quiet strength was a balm to her wounded spirit. Over the ensuing months, the Thorn Ranch transformed. The shadow of Jedediah gradually receded, though Elias remained watchful. But the fear that had once permeated Lila's every waking moment began to fade. replaced by a growing sense of peace and belonging. She was no longer just the cook. She was an integral part of the ranch, her days filled with purposeful activity, her evenings often spent in quiet companionship with Elias. Tom, thriving under Elias's gruff but patient tutelage, became a different boy, his solemnity replaced by a child's natural exuberance, his laughter echoing through the once silent halls of the main house. He followed Elias around like a shadow, learning the ways of the ranch, his small hands eager to help. The relationship between Elias and Lila deepened, evolving from one of protector and protected to a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and a quiet, unspoken love. There were no grand declarations, no passionate embraces, but rather a slow, steady weaving together of two solitary lives. It was in the shared smiles over Tom's antics, the comfortable silences as they watched the sunset paint the sky, the way their hands would sometimes brush as they worked side by side in the garden Lila had started, coaxing green life from the arid soil. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the porch watching the harvest moon rise, Elias turned to her. He'd been quiet for a long time, watching the silver light bathe the land he loved. "Lila," he said, his voice husky. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "This ranch needs a mistress, and Tom needs a father." A real 1 inch. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with a hesitant hope. "And I need a wife. If you'd consider it." Lila's heart swelled. Tears welled, but they were tears of pure joy. She thought of the long, lonely road she had traveled, the fear and desperation. And then she looked at this good, strong man beside her, the man who had offered her not just safety, but a home and a love she had never thought to find. "Yes, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, yes." Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the parlor of the main house, with the local preacher, a grizzled old ranch hand as witness, and Tom, beaming as the ring bearer. Lila wore a new dress, the color of a desert sunrise, sewn by her own hands. Elias, looking uncharacteristically nervous but undeniably happy, stood tall and proud beside her. As they spoke their vows, the words resonated with a truth and depth that touched everyone present. This was not just a marriage of convenience, but a union of two souls who had found solace and love in each other's company. Life on the Thorn Ranch settled into a new rhythm, one filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet contentment of a family reborn. Elias, the solitary cattle baron, found his life immeasurably enriched by the love of his wife and the antics of his adopted son. The memory of Martha was still there, a cherished part of his past, but it no longer cast a shadow over his present. Instead, it was a gentle reminder of the preciousness of love, in all its forms. Lila, no longer haunted by her past, blossomed. She became the heart of the ranch, her gentle strength and quiet wisdom earning her the respect of the ranch hands and the affection of the few neighbors they encountered. She brought beauty and order to the main house, her laughter a frequent melody, her love for Elias and Tom a constant, unwavering presence. Years passed. Tom grew into a fine young man, strong and capable, with Elias's quiet integrity and Lila's compassionate heart. The Thorn Ranch prospered, not just in cattle and land, but in happiness and love. Their story, the tale of the lonely cattle baron who had posted for a cook and found a family instead, became a quiet legend in that corner of the harsh, beautiful land, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the unexpected paths to happiness, and the enduring power of love to heal, to transform, and to create a legacy of hope where once there had only been solitude. The wind still whispered through the grama grass, but now it carried not just the secrets of the desert, but the echoes of laughter, love, and a life reclaimed.